The Grimshaw estate stood like a monument to old money and older secrets, perched at the very edge of Ashford village, where the fog rolled in thick from the moors every evening without fail. It was 1881, and the house had been there for nearly 200 years, its stone walls dark with age and damp, its windows tall and narrow like the eyes of something watchful. The people of the village loved the Grimshaws the way poor people love their benefactors, with a mixture of gratitude and quiet resentment, because the family owned half the land, funded the church repairs, employed most of the men in the quarry and most of the women in the textile mill, and hosted Christmas gatherings where even the poorest families received a ham and a shilling. Eleanor Grimshaw was a fixture at Sunday services, always in the front pew, always dressed in black even though her husband had been dead for 15 years, always with her daughters arranged beside her like a collection of porcelain dolls, silent and still and impossibly beautiful. The town spoke well of her in daylight, calling her a woman of faith and charity, a pillar of the community, a mother who raised her girls with discipline and grace. But when the sun went down, and the fog crept in and the oil lamps were lit in the village homes, the whispers began, and they always circled back to the same dark truth that no one wanted to say aloud but everyone knew. No Grimshaw daughter had ever married, not one, not in living memory and not in the memory of those who came before. There had been 4 daughters over the years, each one more lovely than the last, and each one had been courted by respectable men, men with money or education or good family names, men who believed they could break whatever curse or tradition kept the Grimshaw women bound to that house. But every single time, the same thing happened. The engagement would be announced, the wedding date set, the dress made, the church reserved, the flowers ordered, and then the night before the ceremony, the bride would vanish, just gone. No screams, no struggle, no body ever found. The first time it happened, the town had searched for days, combing the moors and dragging the river and questioning every traveller on the road, but there was nothing. The second time, the search was shorter, more hesitant, because people were beginning to understand that this was not something they were meant to solve. By the third time, no one searched at all. The constable would visit the estate, ask his questions, write his report, and leave with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground, and Eleanor Grimshaw would stand in the doorway of her great stone house and tell him the same thing she told everyone else. God's will, a test of faith. Her daughters were not meant for this world. They had been called home. And the town, because it depended on the Grimshaws for work and charity, and because it feared what might happen if they asked too many questions, accepted this explanation and moved on. Eleanor Grimshaw was 53 years old in the autumn of 1881, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet, unyielding power that made people step aside when she walked down the street. She was tall and thin, with sharp cheekbones and pale grey eyes that never seemed to blink, and she spoke in a low, calm voice that demanded obedience without ever rising in volume. She had raised her daughters the same way her mother had raised her, with strict routines and stricter rules, with scripture readings every morning and evening prayers every night, with lessons in etiquette and embroidery and silence, because a woman's voice, she believed, should only be heard in hymns and confessions. She taught them that marriage was a sacred union, a covenant before God, but that most men were unworthy of such purity, that most marriages were corrupted by lust and greed and the fallen nature of the world. She taught them that their bodies were temples, that their souls were spotless, and that to give themselves to a man without the proper sanctification was to invite damnation. And her daughters, because they trusted her, because they had no other mother and no other guide, believed every word. Annabel Grimshaw was 19 years old when she disappeared, and by all accounts she had been the gentlest of Eleanor's daughters, the one who smiled at strangers and helped the cook in the kitchen and spent her afternoons reading to the elderly women in the village almshouse. She had soft brown hair that curled at the ends and green eyes that seemed to carry light even on the greyest days, and when Thomas Whitmore, the son of a successful textile merchant from Manchester, came to Ashford on business and saw her singing in the church choir, he fell in love so quickly and so completely that he proposed within 3 months. Eleanor had seemed pleased at first, nodding her approval when Thomas came to the estate with flowers and a letter of intent, sitting quietly in the parlour while he spoke of his prospects and his devotion, and his promise to care for Annabel as a husband should. She had even allowed the engagement to proceed, permitted the banns to be read in church, watched as the seamstress measured Annabel for a gown of ivory silk and Belgian lace. But those who knew Eleanor well, the servants who had worked in the house for decades, noticed something strange in her demeanor during those weeks leading up to the wedding. She spent more time in the chapel than usual, praying for hours in the cold stone silence, and she began insisting that Annabel accompany her, kneeling beside her on the hard floor until the girl's knees were bruised and her hands were numb. She spoke often about purity, about the sanctity of the body, about the dangers of earthly desire, and she would place her hand on Annabel's head and say in that calm, unshakable voice that marriage was a test, that only the truly worthy could pass through it without losing their souls. The night before the wedding, Annabel was seen walking toward the family chapel just as the sun was setting and the fog was beginning to roll in from the moors. She was wearing a white nightgown and a shawl, and her hair was loose down her back, and several witnesses later said she looked peaceful, almost serene, as if she were walking towards something she had been expecting. The gardener saw her from the greenhouse and thought nothing of it, assuming she was going to pray as her mother often did, and the cook saw her through the kitchen window and assumed the same. No one thought to follow her. No one thought to ask why she was going to the chapel alone at dusk on the night before her wedding. And no one saw her come back. When morning arrived and the house stirred and the wedding preparations began, Annabel's room was empty. Her bed had not been slept in. Her wedding dress hung untouched on the wardrobe door. Thomas Whitmore, waiting at the church with his family and half the village in attendance, grew pale and then frantic when the bride did not arrive, and he ran to the estate demanding answers, pounding on the door until Eleanor herself appeared, dressed in black as always, her face composed and unreadable. She told him that Annabel had gone to pray the night before and had not returned, that God must have called her away, that she was not ready to become a wife, and that it was not for mortal men to question the will of heaven. Thomas did not accept this. He searched the estate himself, tearing through the gardens and the stables and the chapel, shouting Annabel's name until his voice went hoarse. But he found nothing. The authorities were summoned, and they conducted their own search, examining the grounds and questioning the servants, and dragging the small pond behind the house. But there was no body, no blood, no sign of struggle or foul play. Eleanor stood by calmly through it all, answering questions with the same serene certainty, insisting that her daughter had been taken by God's hand and that no earthly investigation could bring her back. She showed them Annabel's room, untouched and perfectly neat, and she showed them the chapel, empty and silent and smelling faintly of incense and old stone. She wept only once, during the final interview with the constable, and even then her tears were quiet and controlled, the tears of a woman who had accepted a terrible loss with grace and faith. The town, because it wanted to believe in something other than the unthinkable, accepted her story. Thomas Whitmore left Ashford and never returned, broken by grief and confusion, and the investigation was quietly closed. Eleanor had Annabel's portrait painted from memory and hung it in the chapel, draped in white lace as if the girl were a saint or a martyr, and she kept fresh flowers beneath it every week for the rest of her life. The wedding dress was folded carefully and placed in a trunk in the attic, never to be worn, and Annabel's bedroom door was locked with a key that Eleanor wore on a chain around her neck. The room was never opened again. The servants were forbidden to speak of Annabel except in prayers, and the town, though it whispered in private, said nothing aloud. And Eleanor Grimshaw, standing alone in the chapel with her daughter's portrait watching her from the wall, felt something close to peace, because she had done what needed to be done, what her own mother had taught her was necessary, what God himself had commanded in the visions that came to her in the night. Annabel had been saved, purified, protected from the corruption of marriage and the sin of the flesh. She was perfect now, and she would remain perfect forever. 5 years after Annabel disappeared, Clara Grimshaw became engaged to a young doctor named Edmund Price, who had come to Ashford to establish a practice, and who believed, with the confidence of educated men, that reason could triumph over superstition. Clara was 21 years old and nothing like her vanished sister. Where Annabel had been soft and gentle, Clara was sharp and bright, quick to laugh and quicker to argue. A girl who read books her mother disapproved of and asked questions that made the vicar uncomfortable. She had auburn hair that she refused to pin properly and a stubborn set to her jaw that reminded people of her father, the man who had died when she was still a child and left Eleanor to raise the daughters alone. When Edmund Price met Clara at a village assembly and found her debating the merits of modern medicine with a visiting scholar, he was captivated not just by her beauty, but by her mind, and he pursued her with letters and visits and long conversations that stretched late into the evening. Eleanor watched this courtship with the same calm exterior she had shown with Annabel, sitting in the corner of the parlour with her hands folded in her lap, saying little, but always present, always listening. Clara, who had grown up hearing the whispers about her sister, confronted her mother directly one evening and told her she did not believe in curses, that Annabel had probably run away to escape the suffocating life of this house, and that she herself would marry Edmund and leave Ashford and live a normal life, far from the fog and the gossip and the chapel, where her mother spent too many hours in prayer. Eleanor had listened to this outburst without expression, and when Clara finished, breathless and defiant, her mother had simply smiled and said that faith was not a matter of belief but of obedience, and that Clara would understand this in time. The engagement proceeded, and the wedding was set for October, and Clara threw herself into the preparations with an almost frantic energy, as if she could outrun whatever shadow hung over the Grimshaw name by sheer force of will. She ordered a dress even more elaborate than Annabel's, planned a reception that would host 100 guests, insisted that the ceremony be held in the village church rather than the family chapel, as if distance from that cold stone building could protect her. Edmund, who loved her fiercely and believed that his education and his position could shield her from the past, supported every decision she made, even when the townspeople muttered that she was tempting fate, that the Grimshaw daughters were not meant to marry, that something terrible would happen if she tried. But Clara laughed at their warnings and told Edmund that the only curse in this world was ignorance and fear, and that they would prove everyone wrong. The night before the wedding, as the September evening turned cold and the fog crept in earlier than usual, Clara was in her room with the seamstress making final adjustments to her gown when Eleanor appeared in the doorway and asked to speak with her daughter alone. The seamstress left quickly, sensing the tension, and Eleanor closed the door behind her and stood there looking at Clara with those pale grey eyes that never seemed to blink. She told Clara that there was a tradition in their family, a ritual of purification that every bride must undergo before the wedding, a blessing that had been passed down through generations of Grimshaw women, and that could not be ignored. Clara, who had been expecting some kind of confrontation, felt a chill run through her but tried to laugh it off, saying she did not need any blessings and that she would marry Edmund tomorrow with or without her mother's approval. But Eleanor's voice remained calm and steady as she explained that this was not a matter of choice, that the ritual must be performed in the chapel at dusk, and that if Clara refused, she would bring a curse not just on herself, but on Edmund and any children they might have. She spoke with such certainty, such quiet authority, that Clara found herself wavering, found herself remembering Annabel's face in the portrait downstairs, found herself thinking that perhaps it would be easier to simply go through with whatever her mother wanted and be done with it. And so, as the sun began to set and the fog turned the world grey and indistinct, Clara walked beside her mother toward the family chapel, her hand held tightly in Eleanor's cold grip. Several people saw them, the gardener and the stable boy and a maid hanging laundry, who would later swear in court that she heard Clara singing, her voice high and clear in the twilight, a hymn about lambs and sacrifice and the shepherd who protects his flock. She sounded calm. She sounded almost happy. And she never came back. When morning arrived and Edmund Price stood at the altar in the village church waiting for his bride, surrounded by flowers and guests, and a future that would never arrive, Clara Grimshaw was gone as completely as her sister had been, vanished without a trace, without a scream, without a single drop of blood to mark her passing. Edmund did not accept Eleanor's explanation this time. He was a man of science, a doctor who had studied anatomy and pathology, and he knew that people did not simply disappear into thin air because God willed it. He demanded an investigation, threatened legal action, wrote to authorities in London, and forced the local constable to conduct a thorough search of the entire estate. They found nothing. No hidden rooms, no disturbed earth, no sign that Clara had ever been harmed or taken against her will. The chapel was examined from floor to ceiling, every stone checked, every corner inspected, and it was empty except for the smell of incense and the portrait of Annabel watching from the wall. Eleanor wept publicly this time, standing in the village square and calling it the devil's work, saying that her family was cursed by forces beyond human understanding, that she had tried to protect Clara but had failed, and that she would spend the rest of her life praying for her daughter's soul. The town, which had been willing to accept one disappearance as tragedy and even two as terrible coincidence, began to truly fear that the Grimshaw women were cursed by something darker than God, something old and hungry that lived in that house and took the daughters one by one. Edmund Price left Ashford a broken man, and the investigation, despite his protests, was quietly closed. Clara's portrait was hung beside Annabel's in the chapel, both girls frozen in paint and lace, both smiling faintly as if they knew a secret the living could never understand. The truth that no one in Ashford could have imagined, the truth that would have shattered their understanding of faith and motherhood and the nature of evil itself, lay hidden beneath the stone floor of the Grimshaw family chapel, accessible only through a trap door concealed behind the altar where Eleanor knelt to pray every morning and every night. She had built the chamber herself over the course of 10 years, beginning the year her husband died, and she found herself alone with 4 daughters and a responsibility she believed was ordained by God. She had hired workers from distant towns, men who did not know the Grimshaw name and who were paid well to dig in silence and ask no questions, and she had supervised every stage of the construction with meticulous care, ensuring that the entrance was perfectly hidden beneath a section of the altar stone that could be lifted only if you knew exactly where to press. The chamber itself was small, barely 12 feet square, with walls of thick grey stone that wept with moisture and a ceiling so low that even Eleanor had to stoop when she descended the narrow stairs. There were no windows, no ventilation except for thin gaps between the stones that allowed the faintest whisper of air to circulate, and the only light came from the candles Eleanor brought with her when she visited, their flames casting long shadows that made the space feel even more like a tomb. Inside the chamber were 3 stone basins, each one carved from a single piece of granite and large enough to hold a human body, and inside each basin was a daughter. Annabel lay in the first, her brown hair floating around her face like seaweed, her skin pale as milk beneath the surface of the preserving liquid. Clara occupied the second, her auburn hair darkened to the colour of dried blood, her body perfectly still except for the faint, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. The third basin was empty, waiting. Eleanor had learned the method from her own mother, who had learned it from a manuscript so old that its pages crumbled at the touch, a medieval text, written by monks who had studied the preservation of saints and martyrs, and who had discovered that the human body, if treated correctly, could be suspended between life and death for years, decades, perhaps even longer. The process required salt to draw out corruption, honey to seal the flesh, and consecrated wine to sanctify the transformation, and it required precision and patience, and an absolute conviction that what you were doing was holy. Each daughter had been prepared the same way. On the night before her wedding, Eleanor had brought her to the chapel under the guise of a final blessing, had led her down into the chamber with gentle words and steady hands, and had explained in that calm, unwavering voice that marriage was a sin, that the act of giving one's body to a man was the ultimate corruption, and that the only way to remain pure and worthy of heaven was to offer oneself entirely to God. The girls, because they trusted their mother, because they had been raised to believe that Eleanor's word was law and that obedience was the highest virtue, had allowed themselves to be undressed and lowered into the basins, had allowed the cold liquid to close over their skin, had allowed Eleanor to place the thin reed tube into their throats so that their lungs could continue to draw breath even as their bodies were submerged. Eleanor had sewn their eyes shut with thread she had blessed herself, using a curved needle and small, careful stitches, because she believed that the eyes were windows to temptation and that closed eyes would protect her daughters from seeing anything that might corrupt their souls. She had bound their hands in prayer, wrapping their fingers together with strips of white linen and positioning them over their hearts, because she believed that prayer was the only language the dead and the living shared, and that her daughters, in their suspended state, would be praying without ceasing for all eternity. The preservation was not complete death, but it was not life either. The girls existed in a liminal space, their hearts beating perhaps once every few minutes, their lungs drawing breath perhaps once an hour, their minds trapped in a darkness so absolute that it erased all sense of time and self. They could not move. They could not scream. They could not even dream. They simply existed, floating in the liquid that kept their flesh from rotting, their bodies slowly consuming themselves from within as the years passed, and Eleanor continued to visit them, continued to light her candles and kneel beside the basins and whisper prayers of gratitude for their purity. Eleanor believed, with every fibre of her being, that she was saving them. She believed that marriage was a trap designed by the devil to steal women's souls, that the act of physical union was the original sin repeated endlessly through generations, and that the only way to break the cycle was to offer her daughters to God before they could be defiled. She believed that her own mother had saved her in the same way, that she herself had been destined for marriage until her mother had intervened and shown her the truth, and that it was her sacred duty to continue this tradition with her own children. She did not see herself as a murderer. She saw herself as a guardian, a protector, a mother who loved her daughters so deeply that she was willing to condemn herself to hell if it meant they could enter heaven as virgins, as martyrs, as saints. She spent hours in the chamber, talking to them as if they could hear, telling them about the weather and the village gossip and the progress of the garden, reading scripture aloud in a voice that echoed off the stone walls and disappeared into the darkness. She changed the liquid in the basins every few months, draining the old mixture and replacing it with fresh salt and honey and wine, checking their bodies for signs of decay and finding none, because the method worked, because her mother had been right, because God was on her side. And when she climbed back up the stairs and closed the trap door and returned to the world above, she felt nothing but peace, nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, nothing but the certainty that she was the only person in Ashford who truly understood what love required. Margaret Grimshaw was the kindest of Eleanor's daughters, the one who spent her mornings volunteering at the village orphanage and her afternoons reading to bedridden elderly women who had no one else to visit them, the one who baked bread for families who were struggling and who never spoke an unkind word about anyone, even those who deserved it. She had soft blonde hair that she wore in a simple braid and blue eyes that seemed to hold nothing but warmth and goodness, and when she smiled, which was often, it was the kind of smile that made people feel seen and valued and loved. She had never wanted wealth or status or adventure. She had only ever wanted a quiet life, a small home, a husband who would treat her with kindness, and perhaps a few children to raise with the same gentle care she showed to everyone she met. When she became engaged to William Fletcher, a schoolteacher from the next village who had come to Ashford to take a position at the grammar school, the town had quietly hoped that perhaps this time would be different, that perhaps Margaret's goodness would protect her from whatever dark fate had claimed her sisters, that perhaps God would show mercy to the daughter who had shown mercy to so many others. William was a kind man himself, not wealthy or particularly handsome, but patient and thoughtful and genuinely in love with Margaret in a way that had nothing to do with her family's money or position. They had planned a simple wedding, nothing like Clara's elaborate affair, just a small ceremony in the village church, followed by a modest reception in the schoolhouse, and Margaret had seemed genuinely happy in the weeks leading up to it, more at peace than her sisters had been, as if she had accepted whatever risks came with being a Grimshaw bride and had decided that love was worth it. But the night before the wedding, as the autumn darkness fell early and the fog rolled in thick enough to muffle sound and obscure vision, Margaret went to her mother's room and did something neither Annabel nor Clara had done. She begged. She knelt at Eleanor's feet with tears streaming down her face and pleaded to be allowed to marry William, to leave the house, to start a new life somewhere far from Ashford and the chapel and the memories of her vanished sisters. She told her mother that she knew what had happened to Annabel and Clara, that she had always known even though she had been too young to understand it at first, and that she was terrified of disappearing the same way. She promised that she would remain pure, that she would be a faithful wife, that she would never bring shame to the Grimshaw name, if only Eleanor would let her go. She spoke through sobs, her voice breaking, her hands clutching at her mother's skirt like a child begging for protection from a nightmare. And Eleanor, sitting perfectly still in her chair beside the window, had looked down at her youngest daughter with those pale grey eyes and had smiled, a small, tender smile that might have been mistaken for affection if you did not know what lay beneath it. She had reached down and stroked Margaret's hair with one cold hand, and had said in that calm, gentle voice, that Margaret had always been her favourite, the sweetest of all her daughters, the one who understood love better than anyone, and that was precisely why she could not be allowed to marry, because true love, the kind that mattered to God, required sacrifice, required the giving up of earthly desires, required the willingness to suffer for the sake of purity. Margaret was taken to the chapel that night, not singing this time but weeping, her legs barely able to support her, as Eleanor guided her down the aisle and lifted the concealed section of the altar and led her down into the chamber where Annabel and Clara floated in their stone basins like specimens in a museum of the dead. Margaret saw them in the candlelight and her weeping stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it was almost worse than screaming, a silence born of the realization that her mother had been telling the truth, that this was real, that there was no escape and no mercy, and no hope of waking from this nightmare. Eleanor undressed her with practiced efficiency, folding each piece of clothing neatly and setting it aside, and then she did something she had not done with the others, something she had been perfecting in her mind for years, a refinement of the process that would make Margaret's preservation even more complete. She produced a thin iron needle, perhaps 6 inches long and as fine as a knitting needle, and she told Margaret in that same calm voice to kneel and bow her head and accept God's will, because what was about to happen would hurt, but the pain would pass, and then there would be only peace and purity forever. Margaret, because she was paralyzed by terror and because she still could not quite believe that her mother would truly harm her, obeyed. Eleanor found the exact spot at the base of Margaret's skull where the spine met the brainstem, the vulnerable gap between the vertebrae that she had studied in the medical texts she kept hidden in her room, and she pushed the needle through the skin and muscle and into the spinal column with slow, deliberate pressure. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Margaret's body went rigid and then limp, her arms falling uselessly to her sides, her legs collapsing beneath her so that Eleanor had to catch her before she hit the stone floor. But Margaret's mind remained intact. She could see, she could hear, she could feel every sensation in her body with perfect clarity, but she could not move a single muscle, could not turn her head or lift a finger or open her mouth to scream. Eleanor lowered her into the third basin, the one that had been waiting empty for 6 years, and Margaret felt the cold shock of the liquid closing over her skin, felt the sting of the salt as it seeped into the tiny wound at the base of her skull, felt the suffocating pressure as the fluid rose over her face and covered her nose and mouth. The reed tube was inserted into her throat, pushing past her tongue and down into her windpipe, and Margaret felt every inch of it, felt the gagging reflex her body could no longer act on, felt the desperate need to cough and choke and expel the foreign object that was forcing air into her lungs against her will. Eleanor sewed her eyes shut while she was still conscious, pushing the needle through the delicate skin of Margaret's eyelids and pulling the thread tight, and Margaret felt the sharp sting of each puncture, felt the warm trickle of blood running down her cheeks, felt the final terrifying darkness close in as her vision was sealed away forever. Her hands were bound in prayer, her fingers laced together and wrapped in linen, and then Eleanor stepped back and began to sing, her voice echoing off the stone walls in a hymn about lambs and shepherds and the sacrifice of the innocent. Margaret could hear every word. She could hear her mother's footsteps as Eleanor moved between the basins, checking on Annabel and Clara, adjusting their positions, murmuring prayers of gratitude. She could hear the drip of water from the ceiling and the flutter of the candle flames and the sound of her own heart beating frantically in her chest, a wild, useless rhythm that accomplished nothing because her body would not obey her commands to fight, to flee, to do anything except lie still and endure. She tried to scream, but no sound came. She tried to move, but her limbs remained frozen. She tried to pray, but even that was impossible, because the terror had consumed every rational thought and left only blind, howling panic in a mind that had nowhere to go and no way to express itself. Margaret existed in this state for 3 days. Her heart continued to beat, slower and slower as the hours passed. Her lungs continued to draw breath through the reed tube, but her mind remained trapped in the prison of her paralyzed body, screaming silently into the darkness, begging for death or mercy or any kind of release from the unending horror of awareness without agency. Eleanor visited twice a day, morning and evening, bringing fresh candles and speaking to her daughters as if they were simply resting, telling them about the wedding that had been cancelled, about William Fletcher leaving the village in grief, about the town's growing certainty that the Grimshaw women were cursed beyond redemption. And on the third day, Margaret's heart finally gave out, the muscle exhausted by the sustained terror and the chemical changes in her blood, and she died in the darkness with her mother's voice singing above her, died without ever having screamed, without ever having been heard, without ever having been saved. By the autumn of 1881, only one daughter remained in the Grimshaw house, and Evangeline knew with absolute certainty that she was living on borrowed time. She was 17 years old, the youngest of Eleanor's children by nearly 4 years, and unlike her sisters, she had grown up in the shadow of their disappearances, had watched Annabel vanish when she was only 3, and Clara when she was 8, and Margaret when she was 14, old enough to understand that the pattern was not coincidence and not curse, but something deliberate, something her mother had done and would do again. Evangeline was brilliant in the way that survival often makes people brilliant, sharp and observant, and constantly calculating the angles of escape, and she had learned early to hide her intelligence behind a mask of obedience and sweetness, because she knew that Eleanor watched her daughters most closely when they showed signs of independence. She had spent years studying her mother, noting the way Eleanor's pale eyes would fix on her face when she thought Evangeline was not looking, the way Eleanor's smile would tighten when Evangeline mentioned the future or expressed interest in anything beyond the walls of the estate, the way Eleanor had begun taking her to the chapel more frequently in recent months, insisting they pray together for hours in the cold stone silence, while Eleanor's fingers traced patterns on Evangeline's hands that felt less like affection and more like measurement. Evangeline was terrified, but she was also determined not to become another portrait on the chapel wall, another name the town whispered about in hushed tones before moving on with their lives. When Lieutenant James Hartwell, a young officer stationed temporarily at the garrison in the neighbouring county, came to Ashford on leave and attended a church social, where he met Evangeline and found her both beautiful and unnervingly perceptive, he asked permission to court her with the kind of formal propriety his military training had instilled. Evangeline said yes before he had even finished the question, not because she loved him or even particularly liked him, but because she understood that marriage was the only legal exit from her mother's house, the only socially acceptable way for a young woman of her class to leave without causing scandal or suspicion. Eleanor had smiled when James made his formal proposal 3 months later, had given her blessing with that same calm grace she had shown to Annabel's and Clara's and Margaret's suitors, and had immediately begun involving herself in the wedding preparations with an enthusiasm that made Evangeline's skin crawl. Eleanor wanted to know the exact date, insisted it be in late October when the fog was thickest, suggested they hold a small private ceremony in the family chapel rather than the village church, offered to have the reception at the estate where she could personally oversee every detail. James, who knew nothing of the Grimshaw history and who assumed Eleanor's interest was simply that of a devoted mother, had agreed to most of her suggestions, but Evangeline had quietly fought back on every point, insisting the wedding be in the village church, insisting the date be moved earlier to September, insisting they invite as many witnesses as possible, because she understood that her only protection was publicity, that Eleanor's rituals required privacy and darkness and the complicity of silence. But even as she planned her escape, Evangeline began to notice things that filled her with a dread so deep it made her physically ill. The servants, who had always been kind to her in a distant, careful way, had started avoiding her entirely, refusing to meet her eyes when she passed them in the hallways, falling silent when she entered a room, whispering to each other in corners, and stopping abruptly when they realized she was near. Her mother had become suddenly interested in the smallest details of Evangeline's life, asking about her dreams, her prayers, her thoughts on marriage and motherhood and the nature of love, questions that felt less like conversation and more like interrogation. And then there were the sounds. Late at night, when the house was supposed to be asleep and the fog pressed against the windows like something alive, Evangeline would lie awake in her bed and hear noises coming from the direction of the chapel, the scrape of stone against stone, the sound of something heavy being dragged, the faint echo of her mother's voice singing hymns in the darkness. One night she had crept to her window and seen a light moving through the fog, a single candle flame making its way from the house to the chapel, carried by a figure in black that could only be Eleanor, and she had watched until the light disappeared inside the building and did not emerge again for hours. Evangeline knew she had to find proof, had to understand what was happening before her wedding day arrived, and it was too late to save herself. She began searching the house in secret, waiting until Eleanor was occupied with estate business or visiting the poor in the village, moving through the rooms with careful silence and checking every drawer and cupboard and trunk she could access without arousing suspicion. She found nothing in the public spaces, nothing in Eleanor's bedroom or the parlor or the library, and she had almost given up when she remembered the attic, the dusty, cramped space beneath the roof, where old furniture and forgotten belongings were stored, and where no one had been in years. She climbed the narrow stairs one afternoon, while Eleanor was at a church committee meeting, pushing open the trapdoor and pulling herself up into the darkness, coughing at the dust that filled her lungs and squinting in the dim light that filtered through the single grimy window. The attic was filled with the accumulated debris of decades, broken chairs and moth-eaten curtains and stacks of yellowed newspapers, but in the far corner, hidden beneath a sheet that might once have been white but was now grey with age, Evangeline found a wooden trunk with a rusted lock that broke easily when she pried at it with a letter opener she had brought from her room. Inside the trunk were journals, 3 of them, leather-bound and water-stained and covered in dust, and when Evangeline opened the first one and saw Annabel's name written in careful script on the inside cover, her hands began to shake so badly she nearly dropped it. She sat on the floor of the attic with the afternoon light fading and read through all 3 journals in desperate silence, absorbing her sister's words like testimony from the grave, learning things about her mother that confirmed her worst fears and revealed horrors she had not even imagined. Annabel had written about Eleanor's obsession with purity, about strange conversations regarding the sinfulness of marriage and the corruption of physical love, about rituals Eleanor had made her perform involving blood and prayer and the renunciation of earthly desires. Clara had written about her growing suspicion that something terrible had happened to Annabel, about confronting Eleanor and being told that some truths were too sacred to share, about the increasing frequency of Eleanor's visits to the chapel, and the way she had begun speaking about Clara's upcoming wedding as if it were a funeral. And Margaret, sweet, gentle Margaret, had written entries so filled with terror and desperate hope that Evangeline wept as she read them, entries about overhearing Eleanor talking to herself in the chapel about preservation and sacrifice and the holy duty of mothers to protect their daughters from damnation, entries about trying to run away and being caught by servants who brought her back to Eleanor's waiting arms, entries about accepting that there was no escape and praying that death would at least be quick. The final entry in Margaret's journal was dated the night before her wedding, written in handwriting that shook so badly the words were almost illegible, and it said only this: "She knows I know, and she is smiling, and I am so afraid, and I wish I had been braver, and I wish someone would save us." Evangeline closed the journal and sat in the gathering darkness of the attic, her heart pounding, her mind racing, knowing now with absolute certainty what her mother was and what awaited her if she did not find a way to stop it. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to feel not just fear, but rage, cold and clarifying, and sharp enough to cut through the paralysis that had kept her sisters compliant until it was too late. Evangeline read through the journals with a kind of numb horror that went beyond fear and entered the realm of something colder, something that felt like watching her own future unfold in her sister's handwriting, knowing that every word they had written was a warning she might already be too late to heed. Annabel's journal was the oldest, its pages brittle and yellowed with age, and it began innocently enough with entries about daily life, about needlework and scripture lessons, and the small pleasantries of a young woman's existence in a wealthy household. But as the pages progressed, and the wedding date drew closer, the tone shifted in ways that made Evangeline's stomach tighten with recognition. Annabel wrote about her mother's increasing obsession with purity, about long lectures on the sinfulness of physical desire and the dangers of allowing a man to touch what belonged to God, about Eleanor's insistence that Annabel undergo a series of preparatory rituals before the wedding to ensure she remained spiritually clean. She described these rituals in detail that became more disturbing with each entry, writing about how Eleanor had made her fast for days at a time to purify her blood, had made her pray on her knees in the chapel until her legs went numb and her mind felt empty of everything except the words of hymns, had made her bathe in water mixed with salt and wine, while Eleanor stood over her reciting passages from Scripture about sacrifice and redemption and the necessity of suffering for the sake of holiness. Annabel had written about these experiences with a strange mixture of confusion and devotion, never quite questioning her mother's authority even when the rituals became painful, even when Eleanor began cutting shallow lines into Annabel's arms and collecting the blood in a silver cup that she then poured at the base of the altar in the chapel, telling her daughter that this was how the saints had prepared themselves for martyrdom, that this was how the pure proved their worthiness to God. She had written about feeling dizzy and weak and frightened, but also strangely peaceful, as if the rituals were preparing her for something important, something sacred that she did not yet understand, but that her mother assured her would make sense when the time came. And then the entries stopped for several days, and when they resumed, Annabel's handwriting had changed, becoming shakier, more uncertain, and she wrote about overhearing her mother talking to someone in the chapel late at night, though when Annabel had gone to investigate, she found Eleanor alone, kneeling before the altar, and whispering to the empty air about preservation and eternal life, and the holy duty of keeping what was precious safe from corruption. Annabel had been too afraid to ask what it meant, had gone back to her room and tried to convince herself it was nothing, but the fear had taken root, and her final entries were filled with a growing sense of dread that she could not articulate, a feeling that something terrible was approaching, and that she was powerless to stop it. Clara's journal was thicker and more recent, and her voice on the page was sharper than Annabel's, more questioning and more willing to push back against their mother's authority, at least in the privacy of her own thoughts. She had written extensively about her suspicions regarding Annabel's disappearance, about the way the town had accepted Eleanor's explanation too easily, about the locked bedroom and the portrait in the chapel, and the fact that no body had ever been found. She had confronted Eleanor about it several times, or at least tried to, but her mother had deflected every question with that same calm certainty that made it impossible to argue, assuring Clara that Annabel was at peace, that she had been called to a higher purpose, that God's ways were mysterious and not for mortal minds to question. But Clara had continued to investigate in secret, watching her mother's movements, following her to the chapel at odd hours, and she had witnessed things that defied explanation. She wrote about seeing Eleanor perform rituals in the chapel that involved strange materials, jars of honey and salt, and what looked like wine but smelled wrong, too sweet and too thick, and she wrote about hearing her mother recite passages from texts that were not in the Bible, words in Latin that Clara did not understand but that made her skin crawl with their cadence and rhythm. She wrote about discovering scratches on the stone floor behind the altar, as if something heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly, and about finding bloodstains on Eleanor's clothes that her mother dismissed as nothing, accidents from helping with a difficult childbirth in the village, though Clara knew that Eleanor had not attended any births in months. The most disturbing entries in Clara's journal described rituals that Eleanor had begun performing on Clara herself in the weeks before the wedding, rituals that went far beyond anything Annabel had written about, and that involved not just fasting and prayer, but actual physical modification. Eleanor had told Clara that certain parts of the body were inherently corrupted, that the tongue was the source of lies and gossip, that the hands were instruments of vanity and theft, that the feet led women astray into sin, and that before Clara could be married, she needed to undergo a purification process that would remove these corruptions symbolically, if not literally. Clara had written about her mother pressing hot needles under her fingernails to remind her that pain was temporary, but purity was eternal, about Eleanor making small cuts along Clara's spine and filling them with salt to drive out demonic influence, about being forced to hold burning coals in her palms while reciting prayers until the skin blistered and peeled. Clara had endured these tortures because she was afraid of what would happen if she refused, because Eleanor's grip on the household was absolute, and because Clara had nowhere to go and no one who would believe her if she tried to tell them what was happening. But her final entries were filled with a mounting terror as she realized that the rituals were not symbolic at all, that her mother genuinely believed in the necessity of this suffering, and that whatever Eleanor had planned for the night before the wedding was not going to be something Clara could survive. Margaret's journal was the most heartbreaking because it was the most aware, the most clear-eyed about what was happening and what it meant, and yet Margaret had been powerless to stop it. She had written about the chamber almost immediately, having discovered it by accident one day when she had gone to the chapel looking for her mother and had seen the trap-door behind the altar standing open, had seen the stairs descending into darkness, and had heard the sound of water dripping, and her mother's voice singing somewhere below. Margaret had not gone down, had been too terrified to investigate further, but she had written about it in her journal with shaking hands, describing what she had seen and what she suspected, and begging God or anyone who might read her words to help her escape. She wrote about trying to tell people, about hinting to the vicar that something was wrong in the Grimshaw house, about trying to confide in her fiancé, William, but every time she attempted to speak the truth, her courage failed her, because she knew how insane it would sound, knew that no one would believe that Eleanor Grimshaw, the respectable widow who funded the church and cared for the poor, was capable of the things Margaret suspected. She wrote about sleepless nights and panic attacks and the growing certainty that she was going to die, and she wrote about her mother's increasing tenderness toward her, the way Eleanor would stroke her hair and call her the favourite daughter and speak about how much she loved her. And Margaret understood with terrible clarity that this love was not protection but threat, that Eleanor's affection was the most dangerous thing in her life. But the entry that made Evangeline stop breathing, the entry that made the attic feel suddenly airless and suffocating, came from the final page of Annabel's journal, written in the hours before she vanished, written in handwriting that was surprisingly calm and clear, as if Annabel had made peace with whatever was about to happen. She had written that her mother had come to her room that evening and explained everything, had told her that marriage was a sin invented by men to control women's bodies, that the act of physical union was the original corruption that had doomed humanity, that the only way to enter heaven pure and unstained was to offer oneself to God before allowing any man to claim ownership. Eleanor had told Annabel that she was going to prepare her for eternity, that the process would be difficult but necessary, that it would hurt but the pain would pass, and then there would be only peace and purity forever. Annabel had written that she did not fully understand what her mother meant, but that she trusted her, that Eleanor had never been wrong before, that a mother's love was the most sacred bond in existence, and that if Eleanor said this was necessary, then it must be true. She had written that she was afraid but also strangely calm, that she had spent her whole life trying to be good and obedient and worthy, and that if this was the final test of her faith, then she would pass it, she would prove herself deserving of God's grace. The entry ended with a single line that made Evangeline want to scream, want to tear the pages apart, want to travel back in time and shake her sister until she understood the truth. Annabel had written, in her careful, trusting script, "Mother says she will prepare us for eternity, and I believe her because she loves me, and I know she would never hurt me." Evangeline sat in the darkening attic with tears streaming down her face, understanding now with perfect and terrible clarity what had happened to her sisters, understanding that they had not been dragged screaming to their deaths but had walked into Eleanor's rituals willingly, had trusted their mother's love, right up until the moment that love became the instrument of their destruction. They had believed Eleanor's twisted theology, had accepted her assertions that suffering was purification and that death was transcendence, had gone into that hidden chamber beneath the chapel, thinking they were being saved rather than murdered, and Evangeline realized that this was the most horrifying truth of all, not that Eleanor was a monster, but that she was a monster who genuinely believed she was acting out of love, who saw herself as a savior rather than a killer, who would look into her daughter's eyes as she destroyed them and feel nothing but tender devotion and holy purpose, and who would do the exact same thing to Evangeline if given the chance, singing hymns and smiling that gentle smile while she prepared her final daughter for an eternity of preserved, silent suffering. Evangeline's wedding was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning, and by the time the sun set on what should have been her final night as an unmarried woman, she had already realized that she was not going to live to see the ceremony. She had spent the afternoon trying to appear calm, trying to act as though nothing had changed, but her hands shook when she picked up her teacup, and her voice cracked when she spoke to the servants, and she knew that Eleanor had noticed, had seen the fear in her daughter's eyes, and had understood that Evangeline knew the truth. The house felt different that evening, emptier and more threatening than it had ever been, and when Evangeline went downstairs for dinner, she found that all the servants had been dismissed, sent home early with pay and instructions not to return until after the wedding, and the only people left in the entire estate were herself, her mother, and James, her fiancé, who had arrived that afternoon to stay overnight in one of the guest rooms, as was customary for grooms in families wealthy enough to have space for such traditions. Evangeline had tried to catch James alone, tried to pull him aside and tell him they needed to leave immediately, but Eleanor had been there constantly, hovering between them with that serene smile, offering James tea and small cakes and making pleasant conversation about the wedding while Evangeline's panic mounted with every passing minute. She had tried to run. After dinner, when Eleanor excused herself to check on something in the chapel, and James retired to his room claiming exhaustion from the journey, Evangeline had gone to the front door and found it locked, the heavy iron bolt thrown, and the key missing from its usual hook. She tried the kitchen door, the servants' entrance, the door that led to the garden, and every single one was locked from the inside with the keys removed, and when she went to the windows and tried to open them, she discovered that they had all been nailed shut, thin nails driven through the frames into the sills, so carefully that you would not notice unless you actually tried to lift the glass. She ran upstairs to James's room, pounding on the door and calling his name, but there was no answer, and when she finally forced the door open, she found him unconscious on the bed, his breathing shallow and his skin pale, a half-empty teacup sitting on the nightstand beside him, with a residue at the bottom that smelled faintly of bitter almonds, and something else Evangeline could not identify. Eleanor had poisoned him, not enough to kill, but enough to keep him deeply asleep through whatever was about to happen, and Evangeline stood in the doorway of his room, staring at his motionless form, and understanding that she was completely alone, that there was no one coming to save her, that the house had become a trap, and she was the only prey left inside it. She went back to her own room and locked the door, knowing it would not stop Eleanor, but needing the illusion of safety, needing some barrier, however fragile, between herself and what was coming. She considered breaking a window despite the nails, considered screaming for help even though the nearest neighbor was half a mile away through the fog and would never hear her, considered arming herself with something sharp or heavy and trying to fight her way out, but every plan collapsed under the weight of reality, under the knowledge that Eleanor had done this 3 times before and had never been caught, had never left evidence, had never made a mistake that would allow anyone to stop her. Evangeline sat on her bed with her back against the headboard and her knees pulled to her chest, shaking so hard her teeth chattered, and she waited for her mother to come because there was nothing else she could do, because every door was locked and every window sealed and every potential savior was either unconscious or miles away, and because some part of her, some terrible defeated part that she hated, had already accepted that this was how her life would end, in this house, at her mother's hands, just like her sisters before her. Eleanor came to her room just after midnight, and Evangeline heard her footsteps in the hallway long before the door opened, heard the slow, measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world and knew that their victim had nowhere to run. The key turned in the lock with a soft click, and the door swung inward, and Eleanor stood in the doorway holding a lantern in one hand and a white lace veil in the other, her face illuminated from below by the flickering flame so that her features looked strange and hollow, her pale eyes reflecting the light like something not quite human. She was dressed in black as always, her hair pulled back in its usual severe bun, and she looked at Evangeline with an expression of such tender love and such absolute conviction that it was more terrifying than any rage or hatred could have been. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her and set the lantern on the dresser, and then she spoke in that calm, gentle voice that Evangeline had heard her entire life, the voice that had read her bedtime stories and taught her prayers and comforted her through childhood nightmares. And she told Evangeline that she was the last one, the final daughter, the completion of a work that had taken 14 years and would soon be finished. She said that after Evangeline was prepared and placed in her basin in the chamber beneath the chapel, Eleanor would join her daughters herself, would perform the final ritual on her own body and descend into the preserving liquid and seal the chamber forever so that they could all be together for eternity, a family reunited in perfect purity, untouched by the corruption of the world, suspended in holy stasis until the end of time itself. She said all of this while walking slowly toward the bed, holding the white veil out as if it were a gift, and Evangeline felt something break inside her, some final restraint that had been holding her paralyzed with fear, and she lunged off the bed and ran for the door, screaming at the top of her lungs even though she knew no one would hear, screaming because it was the only thing left to do, because silence felt like surrender, and she refused to go quietly the way her sisters had gone. Eleanor caught her before she reached the hallway, grabbing her arm with a grip so strong it left bruises, and Evangeline turned and fought with everything she had, clawing at her mother's face with her nails, drawing blood across Eleanor's cheek, kicking and biting and thrashing like an animal caught in a trap. But Eleanor was stronger than she looked, her body hardened by years of physical labor in the chapel and the chamber below. And she had done this before, had subdued struggling daughters and dragged them to their deaths, and she knew exactly how to control Evangeline's movements, knew where to press to make her arms go weak, knew how to twist her wrist until the pain was so intense that Evangeline's grip loosened and Eleanor could force the white veil over her head, covering her face and tangling in her hair. Evangeline was dragged out of her room and down the stairs, still fighting but growing weaker, as Eleanor's fingers found pressure points in her neck and shoulders that sent waves of numbness through her limbs, and she heard her mother singing as they moved through the dark house, the same hymn Eleanor had sung for Clara, the words about lambs and shepherds and the blood of sacrifice, the melody hauntingly beautiful and utterly wrong in the context of what was happening. They crossed the entrance hall and went out the side door that led to the chapel. The one door Eleanor had left unlocked because she knew Evangeline would not make it this far, and the fog was so thick that Evangeline could barely see 3 feet in front of her, could only make out the dark shape of the chapel looming ahead, and the pale light of her mother's lantern swinging through the mist. She tried one more time to break free, throwing all her weight backward and managing to pull Eleanor off balance for just a moment, but her mother recovered instantly, slamming Evangeline against the chapel door hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, and then they were inside, the door closing behind them with a sound like a tomb ceiling, and Eleanor was pulling her toward the altar, still singing, still smiling that terrible loving smile, and Evangeline understood that her mother was not doing this out of cruelty or madness, but out of genuine devotion, out of a twisted maternal instinct that saw death as salvation and suffering as love, and that understanding was somehow worse than anything else, worse than the pain or the terror or the knowledge of what was about to happen, because it meant that Eleanor would never stop, never doubt, never show mercy, because in her mind she was not a murderer but a savior, and Evangeline was not a victim but a cherished daughter being delivered into eternal grace. The chamber beneath the chapel was exactly as Margaret had described it in her journal, a small stone room with walls that wept moisture, and a ceiling so low it felt like being buried alive even before the ritual began, and when Eleanor lifted the section of altar stone and forced Evangeline down the narrow stairs into the darkness below, the first thing Evangeline saw in the wavering candlelight was her sisters. They were suspended in what looked like glass coffins but were actually stone basins with thick panes of glass sealed over the top, 3 of them arranged in a row along the far wall, and inside each basin was a body floating in liquid that caught the light and refracted it in strange patterns across the ceiling. Annabelle was in the first basin, her brown hair drifting around her face like seaweed, her skin so pale it was almost translucent, and Evangeline could see the dark threads where her eyes had been sewn shut, could see the way her hands were bound together in prayer and wrapped in linen that had gone grey with time. Clara was in the second basin, her auburn hair darkened by the preserving fluid, her mouth slightly open as if she had been trying to scream when the glass was sealed over her, and there was something wrong with the shape of her body, something that suggested her spine had been damaged or deliberately broken to keep her positioned in a specific way. Margaret was in the third basin, and she looked almost peaceful except for the terrible stillness of her face, except for the fact that even through the glass and the liquid Evangeline could see that her sister's eyes were moving beneath the sewn lids, tiny rapid movements like someone trapped in an endless nightmare, and Evangeline realized with a horror that made her legs give out beneath her that Margaret was still alive, still conscious after 3 years in that basin, still aware and unable to move or speak or do anything except exist in the darkness behind her sealed eyes. Eleanor caught Evangeline as she collapsed, supporting her weight with one arm while using the other to drag her toward the fourth basin, the empty one that had been waiting for 14 years, and Evangeline fought again, but her strength was gone. Burned out by terror and exhaustion and the sight of what her mother had done to her sisters, what she was about to do to her, Eleanor laid her on the cold stone floor beside the basin and began the ritual with methodical precision, moving through each step as if she had rehearsed it 1,000 times. And perhaps she had been planning this moment since Evangeline was born, since the day Eleanor had looked at her newborn daughter and decided that this child too would need to be saved from the corruption of the world. She started by cutting Evangeline's hair, taking a pair of silver scissors from a shelf carved into the stone wall and working through the long dark strands with careful cuts. gathering each lock and setting it aside until Evangeline's head was nearly bare, until she looked like a convict or a plague victim, or something stripped of identity and reduced to essential flesh. Eleanor wove the cut hair into a crown, braiding it with practiced fingers and shaping it into a circle that she placed on Evangeline's head, and she told her daughter in that same calm, loving voice that this was how the saints had been prepared, that the removal of vanity was the first step toward purity, that Evangeline should feel honored to be undergoing the same transformation as the holy martyrs who had died for their faith. Then Eleanor produced a silver blade, thin and sharp, and engraved with Latin words that Evangeline could not read through her tears, and she explained that the tongue was the root of all sin. That speech had led Eve to tempt Adam and had led humanity into damnation, that women's voices were instruments of corruption, and that the only way to achieve true purity was to remove the capacity for speech entirely. Evangeline tried to scream, but Eleanor's hand was already over her mouth, forcing her jaw open, and she felt the cold metal slide across her tongue, and then a pain so intense and so complete that her vision went white and her body convulsed with shock. Eleanor worked quickly, cutting through the muscle and tissue with surgical precision, and Evangeline felt the blood flooding her mouth, felt herself choking on it, felt Eleanor turn her on her side, so she would not drown, while the severed piece of her tongue was removed and placed in a small jar that Eleanor sealed and set on the shelf beside the scissors. The pain did not stop. It rolled through her in waves that made her body arch and twist, and Eleanor held her down with surprising strength, pressing her shoulders to the floor and whispering prayers over her while Evangeline's blood pooled on the stone, and her attempts to scream produced only wet, gurgling sounds that made Eleanor smile with satisfaction, because this was proof that the ritual was working, that Evangeline was being purified, that she was one step closer to the perfection her sisters had achieved. When the bleeding finally slowed enough that Eleanor was satisfied Evangeline would not die from blood loss before the preservation could begin, she lifted her daughter's body and placed her in the fourth basin, laying her down in the cold stone as if putting a child to bed, arranging her limbs in the proper position with her hands crossed over her chest and her head tilted slightly back so that the preserving fluid would cover her face completely. Evangeline could not fight anymore, could barely move. The pain and blood loss had left her weak and trembling and halfway to unconscious, and she could only watch through fading vision as Eleanor began pouring the liquid into the basin, the mixture of salt and honey and consecrated wine that smelled sweet and sharp and wrong, that burned when it touched the wound in her mouth and stung when it touched her skin. The liquid rose slowly, inch by inch, covering her feet and then her legs and then her waist, and the cold was so intense it felt like being frozen alive, like every nerve in her body was screaming in protest, and Evangeline wanted to die, wanted it to be over, wanted anything except the continuation of this suffering. But Eleanor had perfected her technique over 3 previous attempts, had learned exactly how much of which substances to use to keep a body suspended in the space between life and death, and as the liquid reached Evangeline's chest, she felt her heartbeat slow, and her breathing become shallow, and her body begin to shut down in ways that should have led to death, but instead led to something worse. Eleanor inserted the reed tube into Evangeline's throat, pushing it down past the severed tongue and the blood and into her windpipe, and Evangeline felt herself gag and choke, but the reflex was weak, her body no longer responding to commands, and the tube stayed in place, forcing air into her lungs in tiny, insufficient amounts that kept her alive but did not let her breathe properly. The preserving fluid rose over her face, covering her nose and mouth and eyes, and Evangeline felt the panic of drowning, felt her lungs burning for air that would not come, felt her body trying to thrash and finding itself paralyzed by the chemicals in the liquid and by Eleanor's preparation. Her mother's face appeared above her, distorted by the fluid and the glass that was being lowered over the basin, and Eleanor was smiling, was looking at Evangeline with such love and such pride, and she was sewing Evangeline's eyes shut, pushing the curved needle through the delicate skin of her eyelids while Evangeline could still see, could still watch the needle approaching and piercing and pulling the thread tight, and the last thing she saw before the darkness closed in completely was her mother's lips moving, forming words that Evangeline could no longer hear but could somehow still understand, words that Eleanor had spoken to each of her daughters as she sealed them into their eternal prison. Eleanor whispered, "Now you are perfect," and she meant it with every fibre of her being, because in her twisted theology Evangeline was finally safe, finally protected from the sin of marriage and the corruption of men and the damnation that came with physical desire, finally preserved in a state of perpetual virginity and absolute purity that would last until the end of time. Eleanor sealed the glass over the basin and locked it in place with iron clasps, and then she stood back and looked at her 4 daughters, all of them suspended in their liquid tombs, all of them perfectly preserved and perfectly pure and perfectly hers, and she felt a satisfaction so deep it was almost sexual, a completion of purpose that filled the emptiness she had carried since her own mother had tried to perform this same ritual on her, and had failed, had died before the process was complete, and left Eleanor to finish the work on her own daughters instead. She had succeeded where her mother had failed, had saved all 4 of her children from damnation, and now the only thing left was to join them, to perform the final ritual on herself, and seal the chamber forever so that they would all be together, a family reunited in holy stasis, waiting in the darkness for the judgment day when God would open the coffins and welcome his pure and spotless daughters into paradise. Evangeline, trapped in her basin with her eyes sewn shut and her tongue removed and her body refusing to die, existed in a hell beyond anything she could have imagined, beyond anything human beings were meant to endure. She could feel everything, the cold of the liquid, the pressure of the glass above her, the burning in her lungs as they struggled to draw breath through the reed tube, the agony of her mutilated mouth, the unbearable weight of her own consciousness, trapped in a body that would not let her escape into death or madness or unconsciousness. She could hear nothing but the rush of her own blood in her ears, and the distant sound of her mother singing hymns somewhere above her, could see nothing but the absolute darkness behind her sewn eyelids, could move nothing because the chemicals had paralyzed her muscles while leaving her nerves perfectly functional. She tried to scream but no sound came, tried to pray but had no tongue to form the words, tried to die but her body refused, and she understood in that moment that this was eternity, that she would exist like this forever, aware and suffering and alone in the darkness, and that there was no escape, no rescue, no hope of anything except the endless continuation of this perfect, holy, unbearable torture that her mother had given her out of love. 3 days after Evangeline disappeared, James Hartwell woke from what felt like death itself, his head pounding with a pain so intense it made him vomit before he was fully conscious, his mouth dry as sand, and his vision blurred and swimming with spots of light that refused to resolve into coherent shapes. He had no memory of how he had gotten into the bed or how long he had been there, only a vague recollection of drinking tea with Eleanor before the wedding, and then a darkness so complete it erased everything that came after. When he finally managed to sit up, his body protesting every movement, he realized that the light coming through the window was wrong, too bright and too angled for early morning, and when he checked the pocket watch on the nightstand, he saw that it was nearly noon, and that according to the date mechanism, 3 full days had passed since he had arrived at the Grimshaw estate. The wedding should have happened 72 hours ago. He should have been married and gone on his honeymoon and started his new life with Evangeline, but instead he was alone in a guest room that smelled of sickness and stale air, and the house around him was completely silent in a way that made his skin crawl with instinctive warning. He stumbled out of bed and down the stairs, calling for Evangeline, calling for Eleanor, calling for anyone, but his voice echoed through empty rooms and hallways and received no answer. The house felt abandoned, as if everyone had simply vanished and left the building to rot, and when James checked the servants' quarters and the kitchen and the parlour, he found them all empty, no fires lit, no food prepared, no signs of life except for the lingering smell of something chemical and bitter that he could not identify. He went to the front door and found it locked from the inside, the bolt thrown and the key missing, and when he tried the other doors and windows he discovered that they were all sealed, some locked and some nailed shut, and he began to understand that something terrible had happened, that the silence and the sealed doors and the missing days were not coincidence, but evidence of something planned and deliberate and wrong. He thought about breaking a window to get out and fetch help, but something stopped him. Some instinct that told him he needed to search the house first, that whatever had happened to Evangeline had happened here, and that if there was any chance of finding her he needed to look now before it was too late. He searched every room on the ground floor and then the second floor, tearing through bedrooms and closets and storage spaces, and in Evangeline's room he found signs of struggle, furniture knocked over and bloodstains on the floor that had dried to a dark brown, and his panic turned into something colder and more focused. A terrible certainty that Evangeline was hurt or dead, and that Eleanor was somehow responsible. He remembered the tea, remembered the way it had tasted slightly off, remembered Eleanor watching him drink it with that serene smile, and he understood that he had been drugged, that Eleanor had poisoned him to keep him unconscious while she did something to Evangeline, and the rage that filled him was so intense it pushed aside the lingering weakness from the sedative and gave him the strength to keep searching. He went back downstairs and out through the kitchen to the grounds, and the first building he saw was the chapel, its stone walls dark against the grey sky, its door closed and somehow threatening in its stillness. He ran toward it, his boots slipping on the wet grass, and when he reached the door he found it locked, a heavy iron lock that had not been there before, new and solid and clearly meant to keep people out. James did not hesitate. He picked up a rock from the garden path and smashed it against the lock until the mechanism broke and the door swung open, and he stepped into the chapel expecting to find Evangeline's body laid out before the altar, expecting the worst because his mind could not imagine anything worse than death. But the chapel was empty except for the portraits on the wall. 4 young women in white lace staring down at him with painted eyes, and he stood there breathing hard and trying to understand where else to look when he noticed something strange about the altar, a darkness behind it that should not have been there, a gap in the stone floor that became visible when he approached from a certain angle. He moved closer and found the trap door, the section of altar stone that had been lifted and left slightly ajar, and when he pulled it fully open he saw stairs descending into darkness and smelled something that made his stomach turn, a smell of salt and sweetness and decay that spoke of things hidden and things wrong and things that should never have been brought into the light. He went down the stairs with his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break his ribs, and at the bottom he found the chamber, and in the chamber he found the coffins. 4 stone basins with glass sealed over the top, and in 3 of them were bodies floating in liquid that looked like amber in the light of the candle he had grabbed from the chapel above, bodies of young women with sewn eyes and bound hands and skin so pale it looked like marble, and James recognized them from the portraits, even though he had never met them in life, recognized Annabel and Clara and Margaret from the faces Eleanor had commissioned artists to paint. And in the 4th basin was Evangeline, her dark hair cut short and floating around her face, her eyes sewn shut with black thread, her mouth open in a silent scream that showed the terrible wound where her tongue had been removed, and James broke. He shattered the glass with the rock he still carried, smashed it again and again until it cracked and gave way, and he pulled Evangeline from the liquid, dragging her out and laying her on the stone floor, and she was cold, so cold he thought she must be dead, but then he felt her heartbeat, faint and slow but present, felt her chest rise with a breath so shallow it barely moved her ribs. She was alive, but barely, and when James tried to talk to her, tried to ask what had happened, she could not answer because her tongue was gone, could only make wet, choking sounds that filled him with horror. He tried to move her arms and legs, but they would not respond, her body limp and unresponsive, even though her eyes were moving beneath the sewn lids, rapid, frantic movements that suggested consciousness and awareness and unspeakable suffering. The damage was done. Whatever Eleanor had done to her had left Evangeline trapped in a body that no longer worked, a mind intact and screaming inside a prison of flesh that would not obey her commands, and James understood that even if he got her out of here, even if he brought doctors and tried to save her, she would never recover from this, would spend whatever time she had left, locked inside herself, with no way to communicate, and no way to escape the memories of what had been done to her. He wept as he held her, this woman he had loved and planned to marry, this person who had been reduced to a living corpse by her own mother's twisted devotion, and he did not know if she could hear him, but he told her anyway that he was sorry, that he should have protected her, that he would get her out and find help and do everything he could, even though they both knew it was too late. He looked at the other basins and saw movement in Margaret's as well, the same rapid eye movements beneath sewn lids, and he realized with sick horror that Margaret had been alive all this time, conscious and aware for 3 years in that liquid tomb, and he did not know if she was still aware now, or if her mind had finally broken under the weight of that impossible suffering. Annabel and Clara appeared truly dead, their bodies showing signs of decay despite the preserving fluid, but he could not be certain, could not know without breaking open their coffins and checking, and he did not have the strength or the time because Evangeline needed help now, needed medical attention and warmth and care if she was going to survive even another day. But before he could lift her and carry her up the stairs, before he could leave the chamber and fetch the authorities and try to explain what he had found, he saw the fifth basin, the one he had not noticed at first because it was positioned slightly apart from the others, and inside it was Eleanor Grimshaw, floating in the same preserving liquid, her body arranged in the same position of prayer, her eyes sewn shut, and her mouth peaceful, and her face wearing an expression of such complete serenity that it looked like she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life. She had performed the ritual on herself, had completed the work by adding her own body to the collection, had sewn her own eyes shut and lowered herself into the liquid and sealed the glass over her own coffin somehow, some mechanism James could not understand, and she was dead, truly and completely dead in a way her daughters were not, because she had wanted to die, had welcomed it as the final step in her holy mission. Her face showed no pain, no fear, no regret, only a calm satisfaction that made James want to smash her coffin and desecrate her body and make her suffer the way she had made her daughters suffer, but he could not, because she was beyond suffering now, beyond judgment, beyond anything except the eternal peace she had believed she was offering to her children. And James, kneeling on the stone floor of that terrible chamber with Evangeline's broken body in his arms and the evidence of Eleanor's atrocities surrounding him on all sides, understood that evil did not always look like monsters, that sometimes it looked like mothers who loved their children too much, who believed so deeply in their own righteousness that they could commit unspeakable acts and feel nothing but holy purpose, and that the most dangerous people in the world were not those who knew they were doing wrong, but those who were absolutely convinced they were doing right. 3 days after Evangeline disappeared, James Hartwell woke from what felt like death itself, his head pounding with a pain so intense it made him vomit before he was fully conscious, his mouth dry as sand and his vision blurred and swimming with spots of light that refused to resolve into coherent shapes. He had no memory of how he had gotten into the bed or how long he had been there, only a vague recollection of drinking tea with Eleanor before the wedding, and then a darkness so complete it erased everything that came after. When he finally managed to sit up, his body protesting every movement, he realized that the light coming through the window was wrong, too bright and too angled for early morning, and when he checked the pocket watch on the nightstand, he saw that it was nearly noon, and that according to the date mechanism 3 full days had passed since he had arrived at the Grimshaw estate. The wedding should have happened 72 hours ago. He should have been married and gone on his honeymoon, and started his new life with Evangeline, but instead he was alone in a guest room that smelled of sickness and stale air, and the house around him was completely silent, in a way that made his skin crawl with instinctive warning. He stumbled out of bed and down the stairs, calling for Evangeline, calling for Eleanor, calling for anyone, but his voice echoed through empty rooms and hallways and received no answer. The house felt abandoned, as if everyone had simply vanished and left the building to rot, and when James checked the servants' quarters and the kitchen and the parlour, he found them all empty, no fires lit, no food prepared, no signs of life except for the lingering smell of something chemical and bitter that he could not identify. He went to the front door and found it locked from the inside, the bolt thrown and the key missing, and when he tried the other doors and windows, he discovered that they were all sealed, some locked and some nailed shut, and he began to understand that something terrible had happened, that the silence and the sealed doors and the missing days were not coincidence but evidence of something planned and deliberate and wrong. He thought about breaking a window to get out and fetch help, but something stopped him, some instinct that told him he needed to search the house first, that whatever had happened to Evangeline had happened here, and that if there was any chance of finding her, he needed to look now before it was too late. He searched every room on the ground floor, and then the second floor, tearing through bedrooms and closets and storage spaces, and in Evangeline's room he found signs of struggle, furniture knocked over and bloodstains on the floor that had dried to a dark brown, and his panic turned into something colder and more focused, a terrible certainty that Evangeline was hurt or dead, and that Eleanor was somehow responsible. He remembered the tea, remembered the way it had tasted slightly off, remembered Eleanor watching him drink it with that serene smile, and he understood that he had been drugged, that Eleanor had poisoned him to keep him unconscious while she did something to Evangeline, And the rage that filled him was so intense it pushed aside the lingering weakness from the sedative and gave him the strength to keep searching. He went back downstairs and out through the kitchen to the grounds, and the first building he saw was the chapel, its stone walls dark against the grey sky, its door closed and somehow threatening in its stillness. He ran toward it, his boots slipping on the wet grass, and when he reached the door he found it locked, a heavy iron lock that had not been there before, new and solid and clearly meant to keep people out. James did not hesitate. He picked up a rock from the garden path and smashed it against the lock until the mechanism broke and the door swung open, and he stepped into the chapel, expecting to find Evangeline's body laid out before the altar, expecting the worst because his mind could not imagine anything worse than death. But the chapel was empty except for the portraits on the wall, 4 young women in white lace staring down at him with painted eyes, and he stood there breathing hard and trying to understand where else to look when he noticed something strange about the altar, a darkness behind it that should not have been there, a gap in the stone floor that became visible when he approached from a certain angle. He moved closer and found the trapdoor, the section of altar stone that had been lifted and left slightly ajar, and when he pulled it fully open he saw stairs descending into darkness and smelled something that made his stomach turn, a smell of salt and sweetness and decay that spoke of things hidden and things wrong and things that should never have been brought into the light. He went down the stairs with his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break his ribs, and at the bottom he found the chamber, and in the chamber he found the coffins, 4 stone basins with glass sealed over the top, and in 3 of them were bodies floating in liquid that looked like amber in the light of the candle he had grabbed from the chapel above, bodies of young women with sewn eyes and bound hands and skin so pale it looked like marble, and James recognized them from the portraits, even though he had never met them in life, recognized Annabel and Clara and Margaret from the faces Eleanor had commissioned artists to paint. And in the 4th basin was Evangeline, her dark hair cut short and floating around her face, her eyes sewn shut with black thread, her mouth open in a silent scream that showed the terrible wound where her tongue had been removed, and James broke. He shattered the glass with the rock he still carried, smashed it again and again until it cracked and gave way, and he pulled Evangeline from the liquid, dragging her out and laying her on the stone floor, and she was cold. So cold he thought she must be dead, but then he felt her heart beat, faint and slow but present, felt her chest rise with a breath so shallow it barely moved her ribs. She was alive but barely, and when James tried to talk to her, tried to ask what had happened, she could not answer because her tongue was gone, could only make wet choking sounds that filled him with horror. He tried to move her arms and legs but they would not respond, her body limp and unresponsive even though her eyes were moving beneath the sewn lids, rapid frantic movements that suggested consciousness and awareness and unspeakable suffering. The damage was done. Whatever Eleanor had done to her had left Evangeline trapped in a body that no longer worked, a mind intact and screaming inside a prison of flesh that would not obey her commands, and James understood that even if he got her out of here, even if he brought doctors and tried to save her, she would never recover from this, would spend whatever time she had left, locked inside herself with no way to communicate and no way to escape the memories of what had been done to her. He wept as he held her, this woman he had loved and planned to marry, this person who had been reduced to a living corpse by her own mother's twisted devotion, and he did not know if she could hear him, but he told her anyway that he was sorry, that he should have protected her, that he would get her out and find help and do everything he could even though they both knew it was too late. He looked at the other basins and saw movement in Margaret's as well, the same rapid eye movements beneath sewn lids, and he realized with sick horror that Margaret had been alive all this time, conscious and aware for 3 years in that liquid tomb, and he did not know if she was still aware now, or if her mind had finally broken under the weight of that impossible suffering. Annabel and Clara appeared truly dead, their bodies showing signs of decay despite the preserving fluid, but he could not be certain, could not know without breaking open their coffins and checking, and he did not have the strength or the time because Evangeline needed help now, needed medical attention and warmth and care if she was going to survive even another day. But before he could lift her and carry her up the stairs, before he could leave the chamber and fetch the authorities and try to explain what he had found, he saw the 5th basin, the one he had not noticed at first because it was positioned slightly apart from the others, and inside it was Eleanor Grimshaw, floating in the same preserving liquid, her body arranged in the same position of prayer, her eyes sewn shut, and her mouth peaceful, and her face wearing an expression of such complete serenity that it looked like she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life. She had performed the ritual on herself, had completed the work by adding her own body to the collection, had sewn her own eyes shut and lowered herself into the liquid and sealed the glass over her own coffin somehow, some mechanism James could not understand. And she was dead, truly and completely dead, in a way her daughters were not, because she had wanted to die, had welcomed it as the final step in her holy mission. Her face showed no pain, no fear, no regret, only a calm satisfaction that made James want to smash her coffin and desecrate her body and make her suffer the way she had made her daughters suffer. But he could not, because she was beyond suffering now, beyond judgment, beyond anything except the eternal peace she had believed she was offering to her children. And James, kneeling on the stone floor of that terrible chamber with Evangeline's broken body in his arms and the evidence of Eleanor's atrocities surrounding him on all sides, understood that evil did not always look like monsters, that sometimes it looked like mothers who loved their children too much, who believed so deeply in their own righteousness that they could commit unspeakable acts and feel nothing but holy purpose, and that the most dangerous people in the world were not those who knew they were doing wrong, but those who were absolutely convinced they were doing right. Script writing. You're a cinematic historical fiction screenwriter. Expand the given single chapter of a dark historical outline into a fully written immersive story section for a faceless YouTube narration video. Focus on a hidden extreme psychopath mind. The evil is methodical, possibly ritualistic or supernatural in nature. The story should explore the psychology of a macabre mind that hides behind innocence or normalcy. Strict instructions. Asterisk. You are expanding only one chapter at a time. Asterisk. The expansion must be deeply immersive, psychologically intense, and emotionally haunting. Asterisk. Seamless transition when the chapter ends. Mandatory style rules. Asterisk. Narration style. Third. Person. Omniscient times. Tone. Grim. Investigative. Slow. Burn. Suspense. Times. Language. Plain. Emotional English. Grade 7. 8 comprehension. Times. Form. Long cinematic paragraphs, only no line breaks, no bullets, no scene directions, times word count. Must match exactly what is assigned to this chapter. You will paste it with the chapter. Times. No visuals, just narration, written for emotional voiceover delivery times. No dialogue formatting if characters speak. Narrate it within the paragraph times. Be open and bold. Do not hold back emotionally disturbing truths, twisted logic, or ritualistic behaviors. Chapter details. Chapter 11. The aftermath and the silence word count. 1,150. The town is horrified. The church refuses to acknowledge what happened, calling it a family tragedy. The authorities destroy the chamber and burn Eleanor's journals. Evangeline is placed in an asylum, where she dies 6 months later, still unable to scream. The Grimshaw estate is torn down. The land is sold. The daughters are buried in unmarked graves. But the town never speaks of it. Visitors are told the family moved away. The truth is locked in silence. A century later, construction workers find the coffins buried beneath a parking lot. The remains are studied, but the methods Eleanor used are so disturbing, the findings are sealed by the government for ethical reasons. Show more. Satu 23M. The town of Ashford reacted to the discovery in the Grimshaw chapel with a horror so profound it bordered on disbelief, as if the human mind could not quite process the reality of what Eleanor had done to her daughters and so tried instead to reject it entirely, to find some explanation that would make it less real, less terrible, less impossible to reconcile with the woman they had known and trusted for decades. James Hartwell brought the authorities to the estate within hours of finding Evangeline in the chamber, and the constable and the doctor and several prominent men from the village descended into that stone room beneath the chapel, and saw with their own eyes what no one should ever have to see, the 4 daughters suspended in their glass coffins, and Eleanor floating peacefully in her own, and they emerged shaking and pale, and unable to speak coherently about what they had witnessed. The doctor examined Evangeline first, the only one who was still clearly alive, and he found her in a state that defied medical explanation, her body showing signs of severe chemical exposure and deliberate mutilation, her tongue severed with surgical precision, her eyes sewn shut with thread that had begun to cause infection, her muscles paralyzed by some combination of the preserving fluid and what the doctor suspected was deliberate nerve damage inflicted by Eleanor during the ritual. He could not help her, could not reverse what had been done, could only sedate her and try to make her comfortable while he contacted specialists in London who might have more expertise in treating such impossible injuries, though even as he wrote the letters he knew there was no treatment, no cure, no way to undo what Eleanor had accomplished. The other daughters were examined as well, their basins opened and their bodies removed from the liquid that had kept them in that grotesque state between life and death, and the doctor discovered that Margaret was still breathing, still conscious after 3 years of imprisonment, her mind somehow intact despite the horror of her existence, though she died within hours of being removed from the preserving fluid, her body unable to survive without the chemical suspension that had kept her alive for so long. Annabel and Clara were truly dead, had been dead for years, their bodies preserved but lifeless, and Eleanor's body showed no signs of violence or struggle, showed only the evidence of self-inflicted ritual, the same sewn eyes and bound hands, and careful positioning that she had imposed on her daughters. The authorities did not know what to do with any of it, did not know how to classify these deaths or how to explain them to a public that would demand answers, and so they made a decision that would shape the town's relationship with the truth for the next century. They would call it a family tragedy, a private matter, a case of religious mania that had led to terrible consequences, but that did not require public examination or criminal proceedings because the perpetrator was dead and the victims were beyond saving. The church, which had benefited from Eleanor's donations for decades and which could not afford the scandal of having one of its most prominent members revealed as a monster, supported this decision wholeheartedly, and the vicar gave a sermon the following Sunday about the dangers of excessive piety and the importance of accepting God's will without attempting to force it through human action, and he never once mentioned the Grimshaw name or acknowledged what had actually happened in the chapel beneath his own church. The authorities moved quickly to erase the evidence, as if by destroying the physical remnants of Eleanor's crimes, they could somehow erase the crimes themselves from history and memory. The chamber beneath the chapel was filled with rocks and cement, sealed permanently so that no one could ever access it again, and the chapel itself was demolished stone by stone, the materials scattered and buried in different locations so that nothing remained to mark the site where 4 young women had been tortured and preserved in the name of holy purity. Eleanor's journals, the medieval texts she had studied, the medical instruments she had used, all of it was collected and burned in a fire that lasted 3 days, the smoke rising over Ashford like a funeral pyre, and the officials who supervised the burning made certain that every page and every tool was reduced to ash so that no record would survive of the methods she had employed or the theology that had justified them. Evangeline, still alive but unable to communicate or care for herself, was placed in an asylum in a distant county where no one knew her name or her history, and she was treated as just another patient suffering from unexplained paralysis and mutism, given a bed in a ward with other hopeless cases, and left to exist in the prison of her own body until her heart finally gave out 6 months later. She died alone, without family or friends present, without anyone who understood what she had endured or what she had tried to prevent, and the cause of death was listed as complications from unknown neurological damage, and her body was buried in the asylum's graveyard in an unmarked plot alongside dozens of other forgotten souls. The Grimshaw estate was torn down within a year of the discovery, the house and the grounds cleared and the land sold to a developer who planned to build worker housing for the expanding textile mills, and the new owners were told only that the previous family had moved away to London and that the property was available for a good price. The daughters were buried in unmarked graves in the far corner of the village cemetery, 4 plain wooden coffins lowered into the ground with no ceremony and no headstones, just numbers carved into small metal plates that would corrode and become illegible within a generation, and Eleanor was buried separately in unconsecrated ground outside the cemetery walls, denied even the minimal dignity of Christian burial. But the most complete erasure was the silence that settled over Ashford in the years that followed, a collective decision by everyone who knew the truth to simply stop talking about it to refuse to acknowledge what had happened even in private conversations, to treat the Grimshaw family as if they had never existed at all. Visitors to the town who asked about the estate were told the family had moved away, and long-time residents who had attended church with Eleanor and employed her servants and benefited from her charity acted as if they had never known her, as if the name Grimshaw meant nothing to them, and within 2 decades there were children growing up in Ashford who had never heard of Eleanor or her daughters, who played on the land where the house had stood without knowing what had happened there, who passed the unmarked graves in the cemetery without realizing that beneath the grass and weeds were the bodies of 4 young women who had been murdered by their own mother in the name of love. The silence held for nearly a century, maintained by shame and fear and the human capacity to ignore what is too painful to acknowledge, maintained by the deaths of everyone who had known the truth and the failure of anyone to write it down or speak it aloud or pass it on to the next generation. But in 1979, construction workers breaking ground for a new parking lot on the site of the old Grimshaw estate struck something hard with their excavators, and when they investigated they found stone, buried deep beneath layers of earth and rubble, and when they dug further they found the basins, the glass coffins that had somehow survived the demolition and the decades underground, still sealed and still containing the remains of 4 women preserved in dried remnants of the fluid that had kept them suspended between life and death. The discovery made headlines, and archaeologists and forensic experts were called in to examine the find, and they were horrified by what they uncovered, by the evidence of deliberate torture and preservation, by the sewn eyes and the bound hands, and the chemical composition of the preserving liquid that suggested knowledge of medieval embalming techniques, combined with a level of cruelty that seemed almost inhuman. They studied the remains for months, documenting every detail, trying to understand who these women had been, and what had been done to them, and why, and they eventually connected the discovery to old records of the Grimshaw family and pieced together enough of the story to understand the basic horror of what Eleanor had accomplished. But the findings were too disturbing to release to the public, too graphic and too psychologically damaging, and the government, citing ethical concerns and the need to protect the dignity of the victims, sealed the research under an order that would keep it classified for 75 years. The official explanation was that the remains represented a historical tragedy that served no public interest to revisit in detail, that the specifics of the torture and preservation methods were too similar to techniques that could potentially be replicated by disturbed individuals, and that the victims deserved to rest in peace without having their suffering turned into sensational headlines. The remains were reburied in a secure location, the parking lot was completed as planned, and a small memorial plaque was installed near the entrance with the words, "For the daughters who were never allowed to speak," and no other explanation, no names, no dates, no context that would allow anyone to understand what it meant. And Ashford, which had spent a century pretending the Grimshaw family had never existed, continued that pretense, continued to tell visitors that the plaque commemorated some minor historical event of no particular significance, continued to maintain the silence that had protected the town's reputation and allowed its residents to sleep at night without confronting the reality that evil had lived among them for decades, had been welcomed into their church and their homes and their community, and had operated with impunity because no one had been willing to see what was happening until it was far too late to save anyone. The story of Eleanor Grimshaw and her daughters forces us to confront a question that most people would prefer to avoid, a question about the nature of evil and how it operates not through obvious violence or dramatic cruelty, but through the slow, patient corruption of trust and love, and the basic human need to believe that the people who care for us have our best interests at heart. Eleanor was not a stranger who abducted her victims from dark alleys or a criminal who operated in the shadows of society. She was a mother, a pillar of her community, a woman who attended church every Sunday and donated to charity and employed half the town and was respected by everyone who knew her, and her daughters, the young women she tortured and murdered and preserved in that hidden chamber beneath the chapel, loved her. They trusted her completely, believed in her righteousness, accepted her teachings about purity and sin and the dangers of marriage, and when she led them to their deaths they went willingly, singing hymns and holding her hand, because they could not imagine that their mother would harm them, could not conceive that the woman who had raised them and cared for them and told them she loved them was capable of the horror she had planned. This is how evil survives. not through force, but through the manipulation of the bonds that should protect us, through the exploitation of the trust that children must place in their parents, and that communities place in their leaders, and that believers place in those who claim to speak for God. Eleanor's evil was methodical and patient, built over decades through careful grooming and isolation, and the construction of a worldview so twisted that her daughters could not recognize it as madness until they were already trapped in her rituals, with no escape and no hope of rescue. She had convinced them that marriage was sin, that their bodies belonged to God rather than to themselves, that suffering was purification and death was transcendence, and she had done this not through violence or intimidation, but through love, through the gentle, consistent reinforcement of ideas that became more extreme so gradually that the girls never noticed they were being led toward their own destruction. Annabel had written in her journal that she trusted her mother because her mother loved her, and that trust had carried her all the way down into the chamber, all the way into the preserving fluid, all the way through the ritual that ended with her eyes sewn shut and her body suspended in liquid and her consciousness trapped in darkness for years before she finally died. Clara had fought harder, had questioned more, but in the end she too had submitted to Eleanor's authority, because the alternative was to believe that her mother was a monster, and that belief was too painful, too impossible, too fundamentally wrong to accept until it was too late to matter. And Margaret and Evangeline, who had seen what happened to their sisters and who had known the danger they were in, had still been unable to fully protect themselves because the bonds of family and the weight of lifelong indoctrination were stronger than rational fear, stronger than self-preservation, stronger than anything except perhaps the final, desperate realization that came too late to save them. The question that haunts anyone who learns this story is how many other families hid similar horrors behind closed doors, how many other parents committed atrocities in the name of love or God or purity or discipline, and were never caught, never stopped, never exposed, because their victims were too young or too isolated or too thoroughly controlled to seek help, and because the communities around them chose not to see what was happening even when the signs were obvious. Eleanor Grimshaw operated for 14 years before anyone discovered what she had done, and she was only caught because her final victim's fiancé woke from sedation and refused to accept the official story, refused to let the disappearance of yet another Grimshaw daughter be dismissed as God's will or family tragedy. But how many other Eleanor Grimshaws were there, operating in different towns and different centuries, performing different rituals, and justifying their cruelty with different theologies, and no one ever woke up in time to stop them, no one ever broke down the door and found the hidden chamber, no one ever forced the community to acknowledge what had been happening in plain sight for years or decades. The historical record is full of gaps and silences, full of families that disappeared or fell apart for reasons that were never adequately explained, full of women and children who vanished and were never found, and we tell ourselves that these were different times, that people were less educated and less aware, that the systems for protecting the vulnerable did not exist yet, but the truth is that evil like Eleanor's thrives in every era because it exploits the same fundamental human weaknesses, the same reluctance to believe that respectable people can do monstrous things, the same desire to maintain social order and avoid scandal even at the cost of justice for victims who cannot speak for themselves. The institutions that should have protected Eleanor's daughters failed them completely. The church, which should have noticed the strange theology Eleanor preached and the disturbing way she spoke about her daughter's purity, instead accepted her donations and praised her devotion, and turned a blind eye to the warning signs because she was wealthy and generous and useful to their mission. The authorities, who should have investigated when Annabel disappeared and should have treated Clara's vanishing as a criminal matter rather than a family tragedy, instead deferred to Eleanor's status and accepted her explanations without serious scrutiny because challenging a woman of her social position would have been uncomfortable and politically difficult. The neighbors and servants who saw Eleanor's obsessive behavior and witnessed her strange rituals and heard her daughter's fearful questions, they all chose silence over intervention because speaking up would have meant confronting someone more powerful than themselves, would have meant risking their jobs and their social standing, would have meant admitting that they had suspected something terrible and had done nothing about it. And this pattern of institutional failure and collective silence is not unique to 19th century England or to the specific circumstances of the Grimshaw case. It repeats itself across time and culture and geography, wherever there are people with power over vulnerable populations, and wherever there are communities more interested in maintaining appearances than in confronting uncomfortable truths. In 2003, more than a century after Evangeline Grimshaw died alone in an asylum, unable to scream or speak or even move her hands to write out what had been done to her, a memorial was quietly erected in Lancashire on a plot of land near where the Grimshaw estate once stood. It is a small thing, just a simple stone marker surrounded by a low iron fence, and it bears no names, because the authorities still believed that naming the victims would only invite sensationalism and morbid curiosity, rather than genuine remembrance or reflection. The stone carries only a single line of text, carefully chosen to acknowledge the horror without describing it, to honor the dead without forcing the living to confront the specific details of how they died. The words carved into the granite read, "For the daughters who were never allowed to speak." There are no dates, no explanations, no historical context, just that one sentence and the blank space around it, and most people who pass by the memorial have no idea what it commemorates or why it exists, and that willful ignorance is perhaps the most honest memorial possible, because it perfectly captures how society has always dealt with cases like this, with acknowledgement so vague it becomes meaningless, with remembrance so carefully sanitized that it teaches nothing and prevents nothing, and serves only to make the living feel better about their failure to protect the dead. The question we must ask ourselves, the question that should disturb our sleep and challenge our assumptions about safety and normalcy and the ability of communities to protect their most vulnerable members, is whether this could happen again, whether there are Eleanor Grimshaws operating right now in our own time, in our own communities, hiding behind the same masks of respectability and religious devotion and parental authority that Eleanor wore so successfully for so many years. Or perhaps the more accurate and more terrifying question is not whether it could happen again, but whether it is already happening, whether there are daughters and sons being tortured and controlled and destroyed by parents or guardians or institutional authorities who believe with absolute conviction that they are acting out of love, who justify their cruelty with theology or psychology or tradition, who have so thoroughly isolated their victims and manipulated the people around them that no one is able or willing to intervene. The methods might be different now, the rituals might take different forms, the preserving fluid might be replaced by other means of control and other ways of ensuring silence, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same exploitation of trust, the same abuse of power, the same willingness of communities to look away when confronting the truth would be too uncomfortable or too costly. What do you think? Could this happen again? Or is it already happening, right now, in houses that look normal from the outside, in families that seem respectable to their neighbors, in institutions that claim to protect and nurture, but instead contain horrors that no one wants to acknowledge? And if it is happening, if there are victims suffering in silence behind closed doors while the rest of us go about our lives and tell ourselves that such things belong to the past, then the question becomes not whether we could stop it, but whether we are willing to, whether we are willing to look closely enough and ask difficult enough questions and challenge powerful enough people to actually save anyone, or whether we will do what Ashford did, what so many communities have done throughout history, and choose silence over truth, comfort over justice, and the preservation of our own peace of mind over the lives of those who are counting on us to see what is happening and to care enough to act.